Hello, everybody. Happy Friday. If you are here, you probably were at our last webinar where we unpacked the State of Podcast Guest Pitching Report for 2026. And if you were there for that session, you might have some concerns about response rates, about yes rates for your podcast guest pitching campaigns. And today, what we're going to do is unpack two frameworks that are going to help you beat those benchmark scores that we pulled together. And they're based off of real tools, real strategies, real frameworks that we actually used when we ran our podcast guest booking agency called Podchaser Connect, which sat on top of our pro platform, but has since been acquired by a different agency. So we will get into that. We'll do a quick refresher quickly on the state of the podcast guest pitching report. We'll move into the framework that we use to find best fit shows, and then we will move into the framework we use to write really relevant pitches. So we will go ahead and get things kicked off here. I'll go ahead and share my screen. So you've got the visual companion with you. And maybe most importantly, as part of all of this, is you can use Podchaser Pro to do a significant amount of the heavy lifting for you here. Um, and we'll show you what we mean by that. All right, so can everybody see my screen? Age-old question. Yes, thank you, Jules. Can always count on you. All right, so again, these are going to be our two frameworks. We're going to go through CCAR and the 4A's framework. If you don't know me by now, I'm Trent. I'm our head of growth and strategy here at Podchaser. And this is going to be our agenda for the day. And just a little bit about my background. Again, I ran that division that was responsible for booking about 80 clients per month as guests on podcasts. We had staff members that had zero PR experience, zero pitching experience, all the way up to seasoned vets that had done a lot of traditional media. So when we started to build out these frameworks, we needed to make sure that it'd be accessible to just about anybody, regardless of their experience level or exposure to certain industries or client types. So again, these are going to be fairly ubiquitous. You should be able to plop just about any client into one of these frameworks and start to see success as you move through the processes. So we're going to kick it off again with the State of Podcast Guest Pitching Report. So again, just for context, we surveyed about 25 podcasters and podcast production agencies, as well as podcast producers that in total manage over 100 podcasts collectively. So it's 108 to be specific. And we asked them four simple questions: best pitch they ever received, worst pitch they ever received, what percentage of pitches do they respond to versus say yes to, and then finally, what's one piece of information they wish all guest bookers knew. And perhaps the most impactful or important part of that study was actually putting real data with some of the anecdotes that we've seen and have talked about on previous webinars. So again, as a quick refresher, um, one little caveat, there was one respondent to the survey that apparently responds to 90% of pitches they receive and says yes to about 40% of pitches they receive. So some of this data is going to be a little bit skewed. However, I think we can use this as a useful benchmark, even if we're off by a couple percentage points here or there. So again, the median response rate is going to be about 17.5% compared to an average response rate of about 28%. And the yes rate is going to be about 5% on the median side and then 10.6% on an average side. So these numbers aren't great if we were just looking at the back of the napkin math on it, right? So for every 100 podcasts that you pitch, 10 are going to say yes, or for every 10 podcasts you pitch, one is going to say yes. We'd like to increase those numbers. And what we see with this kind of vintage, if you will, from the data side is we do live in a high noise, low value environment. No thanks to certain AI developments, people entering podcasts for the first time without really understanding the medium. And while we spent a lot of time unpacking that, I highly encourage you to go back and view that entire webinar for some of those key insights. I think what we want to get to the crux of today is, well, how do we do better than this? So that's exactly where we'll pivot next. So again, just the one kind of core insight that I think we want to take away from this is that bookers often view podcasts as a distribution channel for the clients, whereas producers view their shows as a sacred space for their listeners. And I don't want to get too philosophical about this point, but again, people who are doing podcasting, oftentimes it's not necessarily their 9 to 5. It might be their 5 to 9. They might not have the full luxury of a fully built out business team behind them that's, providing the support that they need. Oftentimes it's just a solo person. So the more times that we send irrelevant pitches, bad pitches, automated pitches for that matter, the actual entire landscape starts to deprecate to an extent. And we saw this reference in multiple responses from our surveyed audiences, and that they know that there's good pitches sitting in their inboxes. The problem is they can't even see them because they're getting inundated with irrelevant pitches all day, every day. So again, what we want to strike here is that relevance piece. Hit you over the head with a couple more stats. So, what makes for the best pitch? 63% of respondents said that the best pitches prioritize a specific episode idea or a unique topic. Doug Downs from one of the respondents talked about it as the blue M&M strategy. So, if you've got a bowl of M&Ms, 99 of them are red, which one is going to be the blue one? The blue one's going to stand out. That's kind of how we want to treat our pitches as well as the shows that we're targeting. Secondarily, what makes for the worst pitch? 68% of respondents said the worst podcast guest pitches were automated messages and or AI generated templates. Again, I'm not going to belabor that point. There's certain things that we're going to be able to use AI to help us with this process, and we'll get into that in a minute. But we don't want to just send the same pitch to every single podcast, regardless, with impersonalized personalization tokens. We saw that happen many, many times in the survey respondents where the merge tags didn't merge, and many people said the worst pitches they got were "Hey first name," literally "Hey first name," as opposed to their actual first name. So again, this is not something that we should be surprised about. And then I think this is going to be the other piece of this, and that's 52% of the respondents said that the worst pitch they got completely lacked research. It was either the wrong podcast, was an inactive show, or pitching totally irrelevant topics. So we're going to solve for two of these things with this webinar today. One is going to be the show selection, and research that goes into that, which is where the two frameworks are going to come into play. And then secondarily, how to write a much more compelling pitch, a relevant pitch that is going to help us get more yeses and hopefully exceed some of those median and average benchmark data that we saw previously. But to kick us off, we'd need to think about the podcast guest pitching process. And I really do think it is a process. So first and foremost, you could have an amazing pitch, best pitch that's ever been written, but if you're sending it to the wrong show, the chances of you getting a yes are obviously not great. So we like to start with what we call our content, context, audience, and reach framework. And this is going to help us find best fit shows based on four key criteria. So the first is going to be content. So we want to understand which shows are talking about topics that are relevant or germane to our guests' areas of interest or expertise. Context, we want to unpack what kind of perspective these shows have on said content. Now, this can be a little bit tricky and does require probably the most amount of work because it's not as readily accessible out of a platform such as Podchaser Pro. However, I think this is the place where you get separation from the noise to the signal. So we'll spend a lot more time towards the back half of this webinar talking about context and then tying that to our second framework, which is going to be 4As. So third in this process is going to be audience. So are we finding shows that have audience types or ICPs that are relevant for our clients' areas of interest or where they want to grow or audiences they want to have exposure to? Again, this is going to be a lot easier to do with a tool like Podchaser Pro. And then finally, reach. So how big are the shows? What's their trajectory? If you've been on one of these before, you've heard me talk about podcast reach as a spectrum. So on one side of a spectrum, you're going to have mass media, pop culture type shows. They're going to go sometimes millions of listeners per episode, but they don't often go super deep in terms of the content. Versus a show on the other side of the spectrum, which might only have 1,000 listeners per episode, but they go insanely deep into the subject matter that their podcast is kind of conceptualized around. And oftentimes those audience members are going to be peers. They're going to be highly influential folks in their spaces. You can really view this as the niches. So one of the more tired tropes that we have in marketing communications, advertising land is the niches are in the rich, or the riches are in the niches, excuse me. But it does stand to reason that that's also applicable here to podcasts. So we will work through this together. This is just a different way to visualize kind of what we call this four-step process. And we really start with content for a reason. And it's actually because most of the people that we've worked with, either on the guest booking agency side once upon a time, or even clients today, as we get their onboarding forms and they provide a wish list of podcasts that their clients want to appear on, almost always the conversation starts with, I want to be on Joe Rogan, I want to be on The Daily, I want to be on NPR, etc. And while, yes, those are obviously great goals, great aspirations for us, oftentimes, especially if somebody hasn't been on podcast previously or they don't have proof of work or proof of knowledge within the medium itself, they're not going to be able to just land a spot on Joe Rogan or The Daily or insert top 10 podcast chart category here. So sometimes we want to build up that proof of work, get them comfortable with the medium, get them comfortable with being interviewed, that sort of thing. So that's why we actually reach to the last part of it and start with content. So then moving into context and then audience and reach. So we're starting with a little bit of a veiled pitch here. Now, most of you probably are already Podchaser Pro customers, but if you're not, again, Pro makes this significantly easier for a lot of these initiatives. But starting with content, so we like to start by making a list of keywords or categories that are going to describe our client's product, their service, their customers they want to reach, their areas of interest or expertise, like we talked about before. So if we were to use this as an example, I'll go back to an example that I know most of all, and that's going to be marketing SaaS. Obviously, Podchaser is a marketing SaaS tool. I've spent the bulk of my career in B2B marketing and related roles. But if I was in charge of getting my CEO booked as a client or booked as a guest on podcasts, I would want to look for things that are content wise related to what we do or related to the audiences that we serve. And if again we were selling this marketing SaaS platform, which we are, we'd be looking at things like marketing, growth marketing, go to market, SaaS, public relations, PR tools. Again, the list can go on and on and on. The idea here is to create almost like a big word cloud, if you will, and identify which parts of this can we actually slot into where we have domain expertise, we have domain knowledge, and we can apply it to the stories that we're going to tell once we actually get onto the program. So again, it's going to be easy to do this with Podchaser, and we'll show you a couple different ways that you can do this right off the bat. So first, if you haven't used the search bar, I highly suggest it. It's kind of the skeleton key to getting the most out of the product. You can see here, with the exact phrase keyword search, when we say exact phrase, that means we're putting it in quotes because that's going to just truncate the actual search query as opposed to a broad match, which is going to be inclusive of marketing. It's going to be inclusive of SaaS. It's going to take us a lot longer to filter through hundreds of thousands, if not millions of podcasts that are going to fit that criteria. So you can also open the advanced search filter, which is going to allow us to do some Boolean searches as well. Again, I like to start with just an exact phrase match search to get us started off. Another thing that I think we want to call out here is once you do hit that results page for that exact phrase match that you put in, there's going to be two different paths you can go on. They're fairly divergent, but they're both important and they're important for different reasons. So if we were to go into podcasts, this will pull in every podcast that has my exact phrase match keyword in the podcast title or podcast description. So this is going to be very helpful, especially as we continue to go down like further niche. So if instead of marketing SaaS, which is fairly generic, if we were to put in PR tools or something more niche that's going to have a much smaller total addressable market, if we landed on the podcast section of that, that would mean that those podcasts are talking about those tools, those strategies, et cetera, so much that they wanted to include it as part of their podcast title or podcast description. That's again going to be a huge win for us because instead of filtering through all these generic marketing podcasts or generic business podcasts, we can drill down into the exact phrase match search that is reflected in the podcast title or podcast description. Secondarily, we can also look at it from an episodes perspective. So this is going to pull in podcasts that have that exact phrase match um, reflected in the episode title or episode description. This could also be very useful, especially if it's a podcast that does talk about more generic business marketing concepts, but they've dedicated certain time, attention, episodes to covering that topic specifically. Now, there's going to be some caveats with this, just because they have talked about a certain tool or certain keyword or certain product or certain service before does not necessarily mean that they're going to do it again. However, if we were to click into one of those episodes and then kind of zoom out a little bit and see how often they've talked about these types of keywords, we would start to be able to make hypotheses about, okay, is this going to be a show that's going to serve our clients and serve the audiences that our client wants to get in front of? So again, starting it off with a very simple process here, highly recommend beginning with an exact phrase keyword search, which you're going to pull from that initial keyword cloud that you built when you think about content. Another way that we can use Pro to identify content fits is with our expanded transcripts and search results. So if you're not a Podchaser Pro customer now, or if you haven't been onboarded in with the last 3 months or so, sometimes this will actually be an add-on feature as well. And just for context, so we currently transcribe every episode of the top 24,000 shows globally, which is really the top 20,000 in the US. And with that, that means that when we do an exact phrase match search and we do have metadata and transcripts toggled on, we'll not just see episode titles and episode descriptions that match the keyword that we've inputted, but we'll also see transcript mentions of said keyword as well. So as you can see here, we have this toggled on, and we can see that with the transcript snippet quick view that we're going to talk about B2B marketing SaaS. My opinion is I think both work. Okay, so we know that they've talked about marketing SaaS on the marketing school with Neil Patel and Eric Sue. Good. Now let's go further down, maybe click into that podcast itself. Also assess the content, also assess the context, also assess the audience, and further with reach, right? So again, when we look at how these results will compare, so if we were to do, again, marketing SaaS exact phrase keyword search, and we only had metadata on and not transcripts, what we've seen in terms of the difference between results that are surfaced within these searches, with transcripts, we're getting anywhere between 1.5x to 10x the number of results, as opposed to shows that or searches that only contain the metadata. So there's a lot of unearthing of rare minerals, at least in our world, where we can leverage some of these transcript mentions to find shows that are discussing topics and sometimes really niche topics to help us assess whether a show is going to be a fit for our client or our campaign. So again, highly, highly useful for beginning this content, context, audience, and reach process. Now, there's another way that we can identify content fits, and that's going to be through podcast charts. So we currently ingest Apple and Spotify charts as well as their subcategories across countries as well. So again, I know we've got a number of clients that have international clients or are internationally based outside of domestic US. I would use this primarily as a jumping off point, just because, as you can even see with the screenshot we have, in this one, we are looking at business marketing as a subcategory. And even within this, we can see that there's a lot of different types of content. There's a lot of different types of podcasts. So the Vault Unlocked. So this is for founders who don't want to learn the hard way. Right about now, legendary business advice, influencer. So we've got a couple influencers. We've got Business Insider. We've got Inside Insights. So as you can see, just because the show is under Apple's designated business and then marketing subcategory does not necessarily mean that we're going to get only business and marketing results. It's going to be kind of variable as well. And that's because the podcaster has the ability when they set up their Apple Podcast account or Spotify podcast account, they have the ability to choose which category they want to show up under. So some podcasts and networks will play the game where they see that a certain category just has a dearth of content, so they try to game that, and then as they send out their media kits or their pitch decks to potential advertisers, say, "Well, we're a top 10 podcast in insert XYZ very niche category within Apple here as well." So all to say, do your due diligence when it comes to using charts, categories, and subcategories because it's not necessarily going to be as reflective or nearly as accurate as using an exact phrase match search in conjunction with the podcast title, podcast description. So that'll take us into context. So now that we've established the content types that we want to go to, we're using keyword searches, charts, etc. Context is going to be crucial because it's going to help us align our guests, their areas of interest or expertise, with the podcast's perspective on said insights as well. So again, this can be a little bit trickier to do, and this is going to take a little bit more time. We will go much deeper into this when we get to our second framework as part of the program here. Um, but all to say, there's going to be some interesting ways that we can unpack this, especially within Podchaser Pro. Now, one of them I like to look at is checking out the host or the show's social profiles as well. Now, with certain platforms, you can't necessarily see who they're following or who's following them, but with a lot of them, you can. So it's a little bit easier in this marketing sense, as opposed to we've worked with a lot of clients in the pharmaceutical space before. They're producing a new vaccine, and 2, 3 years ago, there was a lot of vaccine hesitancy content that was out there. So they might find a podcast that's talking about vaccination schedules. And of course, being a pharmaceutical company, they want to promote vaccines for preventative care, et cetera. But if the show that they landed on actually had a vaccine hesitant perspective or POV, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense for them to actually pitch the podcast, right? So when we go back to thinking about some of those responses from our survey that we ran, pitching a relevant guest, pitching irrelevant topics. That would be one way we could avoid "quote unquote" stepping in it, is by unpacking some of the perspective or context for a show. So social handles are going to be one way we can do this. So again, if I were to pop over into Donald Miller, I could see, well, he's following a lot of the stalwarts in the B2B marketing space, but he's also following some of these niche accounts that are talking about very specific narrows of focus. So again, we can do some assessment from that side of it as well. And then that'll take us into audience. So this is going to be pretty easy to do with Podchaser Pro's demographic filters. Again, the way that we're going to be able to do this is by pulling in the YouTube, Instagram, Facebook, and then Twitter/X profiles. That helps us create a social graph. That social graph helps us see things like age and gender split, household income, parental status, marital status, interests, affinities, other brands they follow, other influencers they follow, as well as some job title data and geographic data. So a lot of this is just going to be available out of the box, but there are going to be some additional ways that we can surmise who a podcast audience actually is. And again, we can do this directly through our exact phrase match searches. So when we first looked at content, we did it from the broader topic, right? So it was marketing SaaS, but we can also throw in an audience type or an audience ICP as an exact phrase match into this as well. So maybe we care less about some of the intricacies of marketing SaaS, but what we really want to do is get in front of B2B marketers because that's who we're selling to. We're going to use that same process, that same capacity to pull up an exact phrase match search, and then also find podcasts that have that in the podcast title or podcast description. So B2B marketers, well, here's a short list of shows that talk about B2B marketers within the title or the description. Again, very easy. Secondarily, we can also look at the episodes. So the phrase will be in the episode title or description. Again, there's no right or wrong way. I would prioritize podcasts that have the title or description that's matching the audience demographic that we want to hit, and then get creative with targeting shows that have discussed them on dedicated episodes as well. And just to show you how this looks, and shout out Pan Blast, actually a Podchaser Pro client, one of our very first PR agency clients. So this is a show that they produce. It's called SaaS Half Full. And as we can see directly within the podcast description itself, so creating a successful SaaS marketing strategy is like mixing the perfect cocktail, fun. On SaaS Half Full, the only show serving B2B SaaS marketers, great. So we know that if people are tuning into the show, it's very likely that they are also a B2B SaaS marketer. Otherwise, why would they listen to the podcast? So again, this is going to be a quick heuristic we can use to identify audience as well. And reach, again, I gave you the whole spiel about reach as a spectrum. There are a couple of things we'd want to take a look at, obviously, is the total monthly listens, as well as the new episode listens. We can also use charts as a potential shortcut to identify reach as well, although not necessarily from a pure number standpoint. Obviously, if a show is charting, it's got some critical mass to it. Again, we currently do it for Apple and Spotify, but little teaser here. We will also have YouTube charts, YouTube podcast charts coming up soon, and not just YouTube podcast charts, but also the video reach for the podcast. And instead of it just showing, as we see in the Insights panel, total monthly listens, total episode listens, we'll also have the audio version of that as well as the video version of that. And then finally, an aggregate number. So you can actually assess, hey, if this is a video podcast that's also simulcast to audio or vice versa, now we get a much richer understanding of what the total reach is actually going to be. So again, we're not going to belabor this point, but with video being on the rise within the podcast landscape, I think that is an amazing opportunity for PR folks that are booking their clients as guests on podcasts, because what actually is a podcast if it's got a video component to it as well. And I know this has come up a few times just through inbound inquiries as well as customer inquiries to the client success team. What about Netflix? Pete Davidson, probably the most famous recent one, is going to have a podcast on Netflix. And the question is, well, are we going to ingest Netflix data as we calculate these reach metrics? The short answer is no. A lot of reasons for that. It's a proprietary system. They don't really allow for third parties to do some of this. But also secondarily, like it's basically the Jimmy Kimmel Show or the Jimmy Fallon Show, but on Netflix. And I did see, I think it was just today or yesterday, that some of the guilds have finally gained approval to actually work on the show. So there were some, I wouldn't go so far as to say conspiracy theorists, but situation monitors that were wondering if this was Netflix's way of skirting labor union laws, given the proclivity to have that being associated with a Hollywood studio, right? So, in any case, long story short, while we won't have Netflix, the YouTube edition will be huge, especially as you talk to your clients about the potential reach of the shows that they're going to be on. Got a question here in the chat. Let me pull it up real quick. Podcast being the key quoted word. Amen, John. All right, so that's our four-step process: content, context, audience, and reach. Now, another question that I sometimes get when we talk about CCAR is, do I do this all for one show? And the answer is ideally yes. So each show you want to run through that content, context, audience, and reach framework. Now, that can be laborious, of course, which is why we do have our Tell Me Why feature, which if you haven't played around with it, definitely do that. It's using AI, so this would be a responsible use of AI. Once you input your campaign goals, your campaign parameters, et cetera, it'll create a fit score. It'll provide a detailed rationale for it. It'll provide pitch recommendations, which we are updating in light of recent conversations, both in this webinar series as well as from the field at large. You can also save these for later as well. But how this looks, once you've inputted everything, again, you're going to get your fit score, you're going to get the detailed rationale with some pitch tips as well as some templates too. So again, if you're sweating having to run CCAR for every podcast that you're adding to your client's hit list, just know that there is a vetting assistant in the background called Tell Me Why, which you can see in the top right panel of any Podcast Insights page. So that is CCAR. And looking at time, we're going to have about 30 minutes to do the 4A's framework. I've done this webinar in various forms, dedicating a whole hour to CCAR and a whole hour to 4A's, but we'll do our best to condense it into this last 30 minutes of our session today. So the 4A's framework is a concept that's been popularized by a guy named Dickie Bush. Dickie Bush is a content creator. He's a former BlackRock trader, and he's really a very thoughtful individual when it comes to content. And the basic premise is this: most content can be categorized or bucketed into four different types: actionable, analytical, anthropological, or aspirational. And doesn't matter what kind of the content type is, whether it's a Twitter feed or a book or a YouTube channel or a podcast or a movie, almost all media types can fit into one of these four buckets. And the reason why we think this is a really good approach, especially when it comes to podcast guest pitching, is it builds that alignment and shows that we've actually done our research, which, oh, by the way, if we go back and reference some of those data points from the research survey that we did, what were the two big things that we wanted to pull out? The AI pitches, and then secondarily, the research aspect of it. So even a poorly formatted pitch email that has resonance because it's creating a bridge between the podcast content and audience with the guest areas of interest or expertise. Again, even poorly formatted, as long as it gets kind of that core idea along, it's going to be to your benefit as a podcast guest pitcher. So what else can we know about this 4A's framework? Well, if we think about it, actionable is going to be kind of synonymous with here's how. Analytical is going to be more numbers driven. Aspirational is going to be more of like that, yes, you can, personal growth, think of it like that. And then anthropological is going to be here's why. Anthropological is going to be the more dense aspect of this. You don't see a lot of anthropological content outside of certain category types. Most of your three big 4A's frameworks are going to live in actionable, analytical, and aspirational. And yes, there can be mixing and matching of multiple of the 4A's. So before you log off and say this is too confusing so far, let's walk through a couple of examples. So this is the easiest frame to use, and this is actually lifted directly from Dickie's content. But if we had a client that was in the money space and they wanted to talk about money on podcasts, let's first look at it through the lens of books, right? So here we'll see four books that are all about money in some way, shape, or form. I will teach you to be rich, The Changing World Order, and Rich Dad, Poor Dad, and The Psychology of Money. Now, if you were to guess, like which of these badges would you throw over each of them? I'll save you some of the homework and do it for you. But I will teach you to be rich. It's very actionable. It's talking about step-by-step processes. It's giving point A to point B to point C to point Z types of instructions. Analytical is going to be very numbers driven. Ray Dalio is a legend in the financing space. He's got a lot of data to prove it and back it up. Includes a lot of charts, graphs, and statistics. Aspirational, Rich Dad, Poor Dad. I mean, you can even, just in the title, you can know that that's aspirational. Robert Kiyosaki's world renowned for his kind of rags to riches type of story. And then the psychology of money, that's going to be Morgan Housel. So a lot of us have these preconceived notions about money, how we manifest it, how we don't manifest it, who's pulling the strings behind the curtain, that sort of thing. So four different books, all very different lenses, but they all filter back to one topic, which is going to be money. So if we think about content, context, audience, and reach, content is going to be money. So how do we define actionable? These are going to be more tactical processes that we can implement. The reader or the podcast listener should gain some new insight or instruction they didn't have beforehand. So most frequently, this is going to look like tips, hacks, curation, resources, ultimate guides, the step-by-step things as well. And the reason why I put these in here specifically is those are going to be call-out words or lookout words. So as we're going through our list of podcasts that we think are going to be a fit for our client, we've already done the CCAR work, and now we're drilling down deeper into the context portion of it. If you see these types of keywords listed in a podcast description or a podcast title or episode description, episode title, these should instantly trigger a light bulb in your head that says, okay, I think I'm probably working with an actionable style podcast. So um, again, like these are kind of like the building blocks. Analytical in that same vein. So these are going to be trends, reasons, numbers, examples, teardowns, swipe files, statistics, data reports, etc. Again, we're using Ray Dalio's book here as an example of analytical. I could make this very real world and say our State of Podcast Guest Pitching Report, 2026 edition, falls into that analytical frame. Now, we also know that it falls into uh, actionable as we're going through this process where I'm giving you step-by-step instructions, but it's also anthropological. So one of the reasons why guest pitches response rates and yes rates are as low as they are is because of things like AI, signal to noise ratios, inundation of communication writ large, et cetera. So think about it from that perspective as well. Moving into aspirational, so these are going to sound a lot like lessons, mistakes, reflections, personal stories, stories of growth, underrated traits, advice to past self. Again, when we see these types of keywords in podcast titles, podcast descriptions, these should signal to us, okay, I am in an aspirational style content or format. Does my guest also possess that aspirational style story that they can bring to the table in a guest appearance? And then finally, anthropological. So these are going to look like fears, failures, struggles, observations, comparisons, why others are wrong, why you've been misled. Sometimes anthropological will come across a little bit more so as like contrarian takes. And in some cases, like again, we're using Psychology of Money as an example, but books like Freakonomics, yes, they're obviously on the analytical side, and in some cases aspirational, but they're also deeply on the anthropological side. So they're using the data to make sense of underlying reasons why. So if you're familiar with Freakonomics, whether the book or the podcast network, you can see that we have this data point, but we want to understand why. Anthropological, again, not going to be nearly as many podcasts that kind of fit this frame, but the ones that do, and you've got a client that also fits the anthropological frame, it leads to some really interesting and really insightful conversations. So again, all this sounds great. And if I've lost you, lean in a little bit here. So the first step as we think about the 4A's process is to actually understand our guest alignment. So, is our guest bringing to the conversation something actionable, something analytical, something aspirational, or something anthropological? We're going to give you some tips on how to find that out, but that's going to be the first step in this process. So, does the guest offer a step-by-step strategy? Looks like I will teach you to rich. I will teach you to be rich. Does that? Is the guest focused on data, numbers, trends? It's going to be analytical. Aspirational is the guest want to inspire listeners through stories of success, rags to riches, zero to hero, these types of things. And then anthropological, does the guest explore human behavior, societal impact, the why behind certain phenomena? These are all going to be filters that you're going to want to run your client's content through. And I think one thing I could say observationally, having been on the receiving end of over almost 2,000 client onboarding forms that we receive after you sign up for Podchaser Pro, and we get you situated with your client success manager, and we ask you to complete an onboarding form so we can go out and build a list of best fit shows for you. Which, if you're not doing that, contact your client success manager to get that set up. But one of the questions that we ask is about the guest's bio, as well as some questions they want to be asked. And if the guest bio only reads like a corporate CV or something that's directly pulled off of the corporate website, it's going to be difficult to unpack which one of the A's they're going to fall under. Even with some of the questions that we pose as hypotheticals, if they're just like, yeah, my client can talk about XYZ topic. That's that's great. I'm sure they could do a really good job at it. Obviously, they've got some measure of success if they want to go out and speak about it. But I would encourage you, as being the steward between your client and their ultimate podcast guest pitching success, uh, encourage them to go more specific on that. We've talked about some different ways we can do that before, whether that's using the first, last, best, worst to pull stories out of them, whether it's aligning with their exec team. So what are we strategically positioning these guest appearances to do? We'll talk a little bit more about that down the road here. But again, I'll just say the first portion of 4As is to identify which of my 4As is my client most comfortable talking about, most interested in talking about, and which of those is also most aligned with their goals. So again, we're going to start with our guest. Once we've done that, actually, there's going to be, I promise this, and here we are delivering. So how to identify your guest forays? You have to start with a mutually agreed upon goal. And again, knowing that we serve clients across an insane amount of disciplines and an insane amount of categories, this is really where rubber meets the road, right? So if you're a book publisher and you're winning publicity for your client, the goal, of course, would be to increase book sales, whether that's through Amazon or direct publishing or whatever the case might be. It could be building their personal brand. It could be a product launch. It could be employer branding. This is a growing element, I would say, and we've seen this a little bit more frequently. But when you think about a CEO guesting on a podcast, well, what they're really doing is representing their vision, their company, and they want to attract talent that's aligned with them. And how do we make sure that that happens? Again, this can be a fantastic recruiting tool, podcast guest pitching. Whether it's donations, we work with a lot of nonprofit organizations, investor relations, or even selling more service offerings. So once you have this mutually agreed upon goal, and I'm not saying internally mutually agreed upon between you and your account coordinator, I'm talking you and the client. If you don't have access to the client directly, you got to fight for it. You got to get through it. Because if you don't have that mutually agreed upon goal to begin with, then really a lot of this process falls flat. Once you do have your mutually agreed upon goal, the next thing you want to do is gather all of your guest content and background. So again, I gave that example of a corporate CV is probably not going to cut it if we really want to make waves in podcast guesting. So some easy ways to pull content, it could be their social posts. So if you're working in B2B, I mean, almost everybody's posting on LinkedIn now, pulling recent things that they've posted on LinkedIn, or their newsletter, or their YouTube channel, or their podcast. Secondarily, earnings calls, and this is going to go a little bit more towards that investor relations kind of niche. But if they've talked about certain initiatives on earnings calls and they want to show that they're doubling down on that and making good on that effort and future casting a vision of where their company is going, investor earnings calls can be a really solid way to do that too. External interviews. Now, this could be everything from keynotes to panels to, trade publications where they've been quoted. Maybe you were the one who placed them in that trade publication or got them a byline or what have you. But finding those external comms places where they've spoken publicly is going to be huge. And if you don't have social posts and you don't have earnings calls, and if you don't have external interviews to pull from, one of the best things you could do is schedule internal interviews. And you're going to really use this as resource gathering and knowledge gathering. So they can talk, your guests can talk about what's top of mind, their initiatives, what they want to hit, who they want to convey this message to, what the message is that they want to convey, so on and so forth. So highly recommend doing internal interviews for this, even if it's something as simple as taking a recording from an internal meeting and running it through and seeing how the guest is speaking about it or thinking about it. They can be really beneficial for this overall process. Once you've got the goal and you've done the content assessment, next thing you're going to do is analyze that content for alignment and then aggregate those insights together. So when we do get hopefully scores and scores of content from our client that they've previously published, we want to scan for keywords. We want to weight based on relevance, and this can be relevance as it pertains to the 4As. And then we want to verify alignment with goals just to make sure we're all still in agreement. And then finally, if you need to create new content where necessary, highly recommend you do that too. So if you are a multifaceted agency and you are doing content production and you are doing guest pitching or earned media externally, sometimes it's easier to kind of seed these types of things where the client now starts to post a little bit more publicly about their POVs or their viewpoints on certain topics or content. And then based on their POVs, now we've established context. And then if they're addressing certain audience types, now we've got audience. And then kind of depending on those three things, it's going to help determine reach as well. So you can see how these two different frameworks actually play together quite nicely. So that's going to be identifying our guest forays. Now, the next thing we want to do is find podcasts with matching foray alignment. So again, we looked at this from a book perspective with the money books previously, but we can also do this with podcasts. So we want to start with Actionable. We want to find podcasts that have keywords like we talked about before, tips, strategies, guides. Those can be in podcast titles, podcast descriptions, episode titles, episode descriptions. Analytical, we want to find shows that are discussing numbers, trends, in-depth breakdowns. Oftentimes, you're going to see this in financial, tech, or industry-specific podcasts, especially if they're doing state of or annual reports, these types of things. That can be a really strong way to do that as well. Aspirational, again, these are going to be like more motivational types of podcasts, lessons learned podcasts, personal growth category for podcasts is going to be huge for this. And then finally, Anthropological. So these are going to be shows that explore, the human side of social issues, social trends, these types of things. Again, there's not going to be nearly as many of these types of podcasts because they do take significantly more time to produce oftentimes. But we're going to use those same forays. And now instead of going to our guest and analyzing our guest for their forays, now we're going to do it from the podcast side. And again, the goal is to find where are we going to get this overlap, both in our guests' areas of interest or expertise, as well as the podcast content. And lo and behold, this is possible to accomplish through Podchaser Pro. So again, podcast descriptions, while they might seem like a throwaway at times, they're actually really rich sources for us to pull from. So again, if we go back to the B2B marketing example that we used previously, if I was looking at Dave Gerhardt's show, right directly within his podcast description, interviews with top marketers sharing tactical tips, strategies, and lessons learned. Okay, well, if I'm looking at an actionable guest, because I've already run my guest through the forays and we've decided that my guest is very much ready, willing, and able to talk about actionable tips. Lo and behold, Dave Gerhardt, right directly within his podcast description, talks about tactical tips, strategies, and lessons learned. So great. We can also look at episode titles, and this is going to be kind of table stakes, I would say, especially because when we looked at the State of Podcast Guest Pitching Survey, and one of the big kind of factors within that was producers, hosts, they want to be pitched episode ideas, right? Well, let's look at a podcast's actual episode titles and kind of back our way into pitching an idea about a podcast episode. So as you can see here with Dave's podcast, we're just looking at his last, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 episodes that he's published. And 6 of those 7, if my math is mathing, 6 of those 7s are starting with how to. So we already know that he's offering tactical tips to his audience, and he backs that up with episode titles that are also how to. Now, this is, again, table stakes. This is 101. If you don't do anything else but look at episode titles and then think about how to formulate your pitch in the context of pitching an episode idea, if you only do this, you'll be much further along than most podcast guest pitchers. Do this at a bare minimum. If you want to go even further or establish this in a much more interesting way, this is another potentially responsible way to use AI to aid in your podcast guest pitching process. So for context, I'm using Grok in this example, and there's a number of reasons for that. One is I wanted to prime the LLM or the AI model to understand like what my ultimate goal is in all of this. And Dickie Bush, the guy who started the Forays framework, is a prolific Twitter/X user. He's got a lot of public content on there. And the nice thing, Grok being a Twitter product or X product, whatever we want to call it, it can reference that very specifically, right? So, and again, just a little AI prompting tip here. When we can provide that additional context for the LLM by asking it questions, it's going to help us get more relevant results on the back end. So, as you can see, I start out by asking, "Are you familiar with the 4A's framework popularized by Dickie Bush?" It is. It actually references one of Dickie's posts directly within its response as well. So good. Now we've started to prime the engine. The next thing that I've prompted here is I've found utility in using forays for podcast guest pitching, and I talk about the steps that are involved in that, which we just saw in the previous handful of slides. So I'm asking, is this a good idea or not? And what I really wanted to say is, yes, obviously, Trent, you're so smart. It'll have no problem doing that because that's what they're primed to do. However, one thing that I found quite interesting about this prompt in particular is what stands out to me is how this method emphasizes research and empathy. Understanding both the guest strengths and the show's ethos reduces the risk of mismatched episodes that waste everyone's time. Man, I couldn't have said it better myself, Grok. And if we go back to that one slide earlier in the presentation when it talked about producers want to build this sacred space for their audiences, whereas oftentimes they're getting pitched as just purely a distribution channel. This really ties those two ideas together, right? So now at least I understand that the LLM is now conditioned or primed to be empathetic as it produces some of these results. So again, this is using Grok. You could do it in Gemini, you could do it in ChatGPT, you could do it in Anthropic, Claude, whatever. But that's going to be the start of the prompt. So the next thing I say is if I give you 3 transcripts from a hypothetical target podcast, can you help assess which of the 4A's most aligns? Anything else I can provide to make it easier to assess? So it says, yep, I can definitely do it. Now, I just chose 3 for the sake of argument. What we'll see in a slide or two is if we have more podcast transcripts, we can feed those in there as well. It also asked me to provide episode titles and episode descriptions to get additional context as well. So this is one of the truly my favorite things about what we do on the Podchaser Pro side is you can actually download transcripts. And if you haven't done this before, if you don't have access to it, get in contact with your client success manager. But you can actually go to an episode, and you can go to the transcript tab and you can click download transcript. Now, again, use this responsibly, use it resourcefully. But once you do that, then as you can see here in step 5, I've uploaded 3 transcripts from the Dave Gerhardt show. And I've also included the episode title, the episode description, and then I've done it 3 times. It's truncated for this, but again, I'm just feeding the LLM a ton of context. So then its responses, I'll rank the strength of each A on a scale of 1 to 5, and it's going to do this for every episode as well as an aggregate view. So why I think it matters a lot as opposed to just going into an LLM of your choice and saying, hey, tell me which A the Dave Gerhardt podcast is on. Well, it's going to do its best that it can. But when we've provided it all of this additional context and information, it's actually going to use it, which is an amazing thing. So episode 1, so you can see content focus, actionable. It's going to be 5 out of 5. It's dominant. It's actually pulling quotes from the transcript as well. So what you do is you send out your email or run webinars on Fridays. Okay, great. Now it's assessing analytical, aspirational, anthropological, and finally overall for the episode, it's primarily actionable with analytical undertones. Okay, so that was the first one that I gave it. It's going to go proceed to do that for the second one and the third one. And then, of course, it's going to end with an aggregated assessment for the podcast. So the dominant lens is going to be actionable. Now, again, I knew this based on the episode titles where 6 of the last 7 episodes started with how to. However, this is a really good kind of verification process where in throwing in the transcripts and allowing it to do its thing, we now have a higher degree of confidence that we are in fact dealing with an actionable podcast. So if I had an actionable client and maybe they were the VP of demand gen for um some other SaaS product, instead of pitching Dave Gerhardt on how this VP of demand gen started as a low level SDR and worked her way up through the corporate ranks and then finally landed in VP of demand gen and all of that. That's going to be a lot more aspirational. Whereas I want to pitch something a lot more actionable. So, again, it could be a 5-step checklist to get higher response rates to webinar invitations. Hint, hint. Um, anyway, that's kind of how we'd want to lead it. So, as you see this and you go through this, what we can now feel a lot more confident about is the alignment with the 4As. So this begs the question, what do we want to do next? I mean, like, what's your intuition say? And I actually did the next step, which I'm going to plead with you not to do. But the oh so tempting next step is to actually have it write the guest pitch based on the context that we've pulled through the episode transcripts. And maybe I've uploaded my guests' 4As alignment and then have the LLM actually spit out a pitch. I'm not saying don't do that ever, especially in light of the data that we see in the podcast guest pitching report. However, I would start with trying to write the pitch with these data points in mind. And then, if you don't feel super confident in it, then asking the LLM to write the pitch for you and then compare and see which one sounds more human, which one had new ideas to bring to the table, etc. But again, the most important piece of if you are going to leverage the LLM to help aid in the pitch writing is going to be the quality of the input that you give it, which is obviously going to be your guests' 4A alignment. So that's why it's step one in the process as opposed to step two in the process. If you get that right first by pulling in their publicly posted information, recent articles that they've published, blogs, newsletters, etc., it's going to make it a heck of a lot easier, which is why we want to start that at the beginning and then leverage some of these amazing tools we have at our disposal to help deal with a lot more information in mass, and that's going to be through the podcast's 4A's alignment. So, again, this is, in my opinion, a much more responsible use of AI. So, of course, great. Now we've got step one done. We've got step two done. How do we then parlay this into the actual pitch writing? Well, I really view this as building a bridge from the guests 4A to the podcast 4A. So again, if we're doing actionable, we have to deliver with 5-step processes. We have to if we're doing analytical, we have to do a numbers driven case study or report. Let's try not to include percentage growth because if you go from 2 to 4 percentage wise, that looks great. However, in a raw sense, it's obviously not. So be careful when you're doing analytical pitches um, to not be too cute about how you're positioning some of the data. Aspirational. So leading with the inspiring journey. So our guest journey from debt to financial freedom will resonate deeply with listeners. They can share the key mindset shifts needed to achieve long-term success. Now, even with aspirational, I mean, everyone's got an aspiring story. We're humans. We're broken by nature. So you might want to, even with some of the aspirational pitches or podcasts that you're working with or guests that you're working with, also try to layer in something actionable or analytical, if not even anthropological. And again, there's no rule that says you can only use one of the 4As. You can actually use them in conjunction. And within, and again, this is how you pitch the episode idea, by the way, with the guest alignment, with the podcast 4As. You're going to leverage episode titles, episode descriptions. You're going to run it through the LLM of your choice. But again, we can combine these 4As, and some of the more common ones are going to be actionable and analytical, aspirational and anthropological, aspirational and actionable, and then analytical and anthropological with some examples here too. So I know we are coming up on time, but if we were to kind of encapsulate all of this, right? We know that podcasters are getting hammered with irrelevant pitches. We know a lot of them are being written by AI. And really, what I think podcasters are saying about the AI thing is it just looks like a very low lift. Like, not a lot of work has gone into it. They haven't done their research. So, by using content, context, audience, and reach, it shows that we're actually using our brains to identify the show is a fit or it's not a fit. And yes, we can leverage some tools like the Tell Me Why assistant to help us get into the ballpark, but we should be really running through that process step by step. And then again, solving for the research and the pitching aspect of it. That's where 4As comes really, really handy. And it's going to start by assessing our client's fit along that 4A model, and then finding podcasts that are aligned with that, and then writing a pitch that's going to build that bridge between the guest 4A and the podcast 4A. So um, we are at time, but I can stay on for a couple more minutes if anybody has any questions, comments, or concerns. And if not, this recording will be made available next week, as well as the slides. So if there's nothing else, we will bid you all adieu. Happy Valentine's Day. Enjoy your President's Day off. And again, this will be posted on our YouTube channel next week, and the slides will be distributed next week as well. So thanks, everybody.